They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but some images tell stories that should never be spoken. As a photographer, I used to believe my camera captured truth, fleeting moments of reality frozen in time. Now I know better. Now I know that some photographs capture more than just memories. Sometimes they capture souls. I should have known something was wrong that first day at the desert studio. But when you're desperate, when your bank account is hovering near zero and your career is circling the drain, you tend to ignore the red flags. You convince yourself that the eeriness is just your imagination, that the shadows moving in the corners are just tricks of the light. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Laura Novak, and I used to be a freelance photographer. That was before the studio, before the rules, before I learned what it truly means to be captured on film. For 10 years, I'd scraped by on wedding gigs and corporate headshots, chasing my dream of becoming a real artist. My small apartment in Vegas doubled as a makeshift studio, with one wall permanently set up with lighting equipment and backdrops. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Then everything fell apart. First, my relationship of 6 years ended when Mark moved out, taking half our shared equipment with him. Then 3 major clients canceled their contracts, citing budget cuts. The final blow came when my camera, my precious Canon 5D Mark IV, was stolen from my car. The insurance company denied my claim, citing a technicality. I spent weeks applying for every photography job I could find, watching my savings dwindle with each passing day. That's when I saw the ad. Experienced photographer needed historic desert studio, seeking skilled professional for portrait work. Lodging provided. Excellent compensation. Must be comfortable with isolation and strict adherence to procedures. Immediate start available. The pay they offered was almost too good to be true, enough to clear my debts and start fresh. The fact that it included housing seemed like a miracle. Sure, the location was remote, somewhere deep in the Nevada desert, but I figured a few months of isolation might be exactly what I needed. I remember the drive out there. My old Honda was packed with what remained of my photography equipment and the few personal belongings I couldn't bear to leave behind. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, the road cutting through it like a scar. My GPS lost signal about 2 hours in, leaving me to rely on the printed directions they'd sent. Follow Route 95 north past Mercury. Turn right at the 3rd unmarked dirt road after the Joshua Tree with 3 trunks. Continue until you see the billboard for Pete's Gas and Diner, abandoned. Studio will be visible on the left after 3.7 miles. The directions seemed oddly specific, almost ritualistic, but they were accurate. As the sun began to set, I saw it. A low, sprawling building that looked like it had been plucked straight from the 1950s and left to bake in the desert sun. The faded sign above the door read, "Eternal Moments Photography Studio," in elegant, weathered script. The parking lot was empty, except for an ancient pickup truck that looked like it hadn't moved in years. Dust devils danced across the cracked pavement as I pulled up, carrying tumbleweeds that scratched against my car like skeletal fingers. The owner met me at the door, an elderly man with pale, watery eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. He introduced himself simply as Mr. Gray and gave me a brief tour that felt more like a warning than a welcome. "The equipment is all functional," he said, gesturing to several large format cameras that looked museum-worthy. "We maintain tradition here. Digital photography lacks permanence." He showed me to my living quarters, a small but comfortable apartment attached to the back of the studio. As he handed me the keys, His hand trembled slightly. "There are rules," he said softly. "Very specific rules. Follow them exactly. Your predecessor—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Well, just follow the rules." Before I could ask what happened to my predecessor, he was gone, leaving me alone in the steadily deepening twilight. The silence of the desert pressed in around me, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind through the building's aging walls. I spent that first evening unpacking and exploring my new workplace. The main studio was a large room with high ceilings and windows that seemed to drink in the desert light. Vintage photographs lined the walls, portraits spanning decades, all taken in this very room. Something about the subjects' expressions made me uneasy. They looked almost trapped. In the office, I found an old desk with several drawers. The bottom one contained stacks of yellowing photographs, decades of captured moments gathering dust. As I rifled through them, one in particular caught my eye. A portrait of a woman standing in the main studio. She wore clothes from perhaps the 1970s and had a tense, frightened look on her face. When I turned the photograph over, on the back, written in hurried handwriting, was a list of rules. Studio rules. Read carefully, your survival depends on strict adherence. Rule 1. Do not take any personal photographs in the studio. If you do, you won't recognize yourself in the picture. Rule 2. Leave the last camera on the right alone. If it takes a picture, don't look at it. Rule 3. Never stay in the studio after midnight. Rule 4. If you hear whispering, ignore it. Rule 5. Don't use the mirror in the back room. Rule 6. If you see someone in the background of a photo, burn it immediately. Rule 7. Do not turn off the red light in the developing room. Rule 8. If someone calls the studio asking for help, hang up. Rule 9. Only develop photos that were taken during work hours. Any photos developed at night will show things you don't want to see. Rule 10. Always leave an old photograph by the door when you leave. I must have read those rules a dozen times that night, my hands trembling slightly as I held the yellowing photograph. The handwriting changed as it went down the list, starting neat and controlled, then growing increasingly erratic, as if the writer's hands had been shaking, or as if they were running out of time. By the last rule, the pen had dug so deep into the paper that it had nearly torn through, leaving raised ridges I could feel under my fingertips. Sleep didn't come easily. The desert wind played tricks with my mind, its whispers sometimes sounding like distant conversations, sometimes like muffled screams. I told myself it was just nerves, just my imagination running wild after reading those bizarre rules. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself the whole thing was an elaborate prank. Then, my first client arrived. Janet Miller was exactly what you'd expect from a real estate agent. Perfectly coiffed hair, blazer straight from a department store rack, and a smile that looked practiced in 100 mirrors. She chatted nervously as I set up the equipment, telling me about her agency's expansion plans and how these headshots needed to be professional, but approachable. "The lighting in here is strange," she commented, glancing around the studio. "Almost feels like it's coming from the wrong direction." She was right. Despite the morning sun streaming through the high windows, the shadows in the room didn't quite match up with where they should have been. They seemed to pool in the corners, deeper than natural darkness should be, and when I wasn't looking directly at them, I could have sworn they were moving. I positioned her in front of my favorite backdrop, a neutral gray that usually photographed beautifully. The vintage camera felt heavy and cold in my hands, its metal somehow failing to warm to my touch, even after several minutes of handling it. "Ready?" I asked, focusing through the viewfinder. Just look directly into the lens and... The flash went off, and in that fraction of a second of artificial daylight, I saw them. Faces in the shadows, dozens of them, pressing forward as if trying to squeeze themselves into the frame. Their features were distorted, mouths open in silent screams or twisted into impossible grins. Janet's professional composure cracked. "Did you see that?" She was staring at the corner of the room, her face pale beneath her makeup. "See what?" I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. "I thought I saw... people. Standing in the corner. But that's ridiculous, right?" She gave a shaky laugh. "Must be these old lights playing tricks on my eyes." "Must be," I agreed, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's try a few more shots." Each flash revealed new horrors. In the instant of brightness, I caught glimpses of things that shouldn't exist. Figures walking across the ceiling, shadows bending the wrong way, hands reaching out from behind the backdrop only to vanish when the light faded. Janet grew increasingly uneasy. She kept losing her practiced smile, her eyes darting to the corners of the room. "Is it getting colder in here?" she asked between shots. It was. The temperature had dropped so much I could see her breath in the air, despite the desert heat outside. "Just the air conditioning," I lied. "Old building, you know how it is." When I showed her the initial shots on the camera's display, she frowned. "Something's wrong with your lens. There's all these weird shadows." "Just dust spots," I said quickly. "I'll clean them up in post-processing." But later, in the darkroom, I saw the truth. As each print developed in the chemical bath, details emerged that turned my blood to ice. Behind Janet's forced smile, shapes took form in the backdrop, humanoid figures with proportions that weren't quite right, limbs too long and bent at impossible angles. In one shot, something that looked like a hand was reaching for her shoulder. In another, a face had formed in her shadow, but not her face. This one was ancient, desiccated, its eyes wide and pleading. I told myself it was just contaminated chemicals. Bad film. Trick of the light. I developed the same shots 3 times, each time hoping the anomalies would disappear. They didn't. If anything, they became clearer, more defined. In the final set, I could make out expressions on the shadow faces, all of them wearing the same look of desperate warning. That night, I dreamed of those faces. In my nightmare, they pressed against the surface of the photographs, like insects trapped behind glass, their fingers leaving smears as they tried to claw their way out. The whispers started the next morning. At first, they were so faint, I thought it was just the wind finding its way through the building's old walls. But as I worked with each new client, they grew stronger, more distinct. They always came from just behind me when I was looking through the viewfinder, dozens of voices speaking in urgent murmurs. Sometimes I could almost make out words. Run. Don't look. Help us. Rule 4 became my mantra. If you hear whispering, ignore it. It's only trying to make you look away from the lens. I focused on my work, on the technical aspects of photography, aperture, shutter speed, composition. Anything to drown out those voices that grew more insistent with each passing day. But it was becoming impossible to ignore the way reality seemed to warp around the studio. Rooms changed size when I wasn't in them. Doorways didn't always lead where they should. The vintage photographs on the walls, they were the worst. Their subjects seemed to watch me as I moved around the studio, their eyes following my every movement. Sometimes, when I passed by quickly, I caught them changing positions, adjusting their poses like models at a macabre fashion shoot. Every client noticed something, though they all tried to rationalize it away. A young graduate getting his senior portraits done complained about feeling watched. A family of 4 kept asking about the other people they saw reflected in the lens. A bride having her bridal portraits taken burst into tears, saying she felt hands touching her wedding dress when she stood in front of the backdrop. I made excuses, blamed the lighting, the old building, the desert heat. But with each passing day, the boundary between photography and reality seemed to grow thinner, and I was starting to understand why those rules had been written with such desperate urgency. Something was wrong with this studio. Something was wrong with these cameras. And something was very, very wrong with the images they captured. But by the time I fully understood what was happening, it was already too late. I was already becoming part of the collection. One evening, while cleaning equipment in the back room, I accidentally glanced in the mirror. What I saw made my heart stop. My reflection was smiling, a wide, unnatural grin that split its face like a crack in glass. But I wasn't smiling. I wasn't moving at all. The reflection lifted its hand and pressed it against the glass, as if trying to reach through. Its fingers were too long, joints bending in impossible ways. I ran from the room, Rule 5 pounding in my head. Don't use the mirror in the back room. It doesn't reflect who you are anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. The desert wind howled outside my window, carrying sounds that might have been voices calling my name. Around 3 a.m., the studio phone rang. "Hello?" I answered, against my better judgment. "Help me," a voice whispered, distorted and strange. "I'm trapped in here, in the photograph. Please, you have to let me out." I slammed the phone down, remembering Rule 8. But the voice continued, now seeming to come from the walls themselves. "Let me out. Let me out. Let me out." Things deteriorated quickly after that phone call. The faces in the background of photos became clearer, more insistent. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were people, dozens of them, all staring directly into the camera with expressions of silent horror. One morning, I made a terrible mistake. I was setting up for a shoot, and without thinking, used the last camera on the right, the one Rule 2 specifically warned against. The moment I pressed the shutter, a blinding flash filled the room, far brighter than any normal camera should produce. When my vision cleared, I noticed the camera had produced an instant photograph, which didn't make sense given its design. The image was developing slowly, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice. It was me, but not me. The Laura in the photograph was pressed against some kind of invisible barrier, mouth open in a silent scream, hands clawing at the surface of the photo itself. Behind her stretched an endless darkness filled with other figures, all reaching, all trying to break through. I dropped the photograph and ran to the bathroom, barely making it before losing my breakfast. When I returned, the photo was gone, but I could have sworn I heard faint scratching sounds coming from inside the camera. That night, I broke Rule 9. I needed answers, so I stayed late to develop some personal photographs I'd taken of the studio. As the images emerged in the chemical bath, I watched in horror as figures began to appear in them, people I recognized from the portraits on the walls, but now they were moving, changing position from one frame to the next, getting closer to the camera. In the last photo, they were all staring directly at me, their faces twisted in warning. I tried to burn the photos as Rule 6 dictated, but they wouldn't catch fire. The flames just passed through them, leaving them unchanged. Desperate for answers, I began searching through the studio's records. In a dusty filing cabinet, I found employment files dating back to the 1950s. Each one ended the same way: employment terminated, circumstances unclear. Some had newspaper clippings attached, missing persons reports, mysterious disappearances. One file contained a journal belonging to someone named Sarah Mitchell, dated 1973. The last entry read, "The photos don't just capture images, they capture souls. Every flash of the camera is like a net, catching pieces of everyone it photographs." But something went wrong. The barrier between the photo and reality is breaking down. They want to come through. They want to replace us. Mr. Gray knows this. He's not what he seems. He's been here since the beginning, always the same age. I think tomorrow I'll try to. The entry ended there, the pen trailing off the page. I found Sarah's portrait on the wall. She was the woman from the photo with the rules. Her eyes seemed to follow me as I walked past. The next day, during a portrait session, I saw something that nearly made me quit on the spot. As I looked through the viewfinder, I saw myself standing next to the client, even though I was behind the camera. This other me turned and smiled, her teeth too sharp, her eyes completely black. When I lowered the camera, there was nobody there. But in the developed photograph, my doppelganger was clearly visible, one hand reaching for the client's shoulder, face frozen in that terrible grin. That's when I knew I had to leave. But escaping proved harder than I expected. Every time I tried to pack my things, they would mysteriously unpack themselves when I wasn't looking. The exit doors would jam, or I'd find myself walking in circles, somehow ending up back in the main studio no matter which way I turned. The final straw came when I caught my reflection in a framed photograph moving independently of me. It pressed its hands against the glass and mouthed words I couldn't understand. Then it smiled and stepped sideways, disappearing into the next photograph over. I watched in horror as it moved from frame to frame, getting closer to the entrance of the studio. I knew I had to leave before dawn. The night hours were the worst, when the barrier between the photographs and reality seemed thinnest. I could hear them moving behind the frames, whispering among themselves, planning. As I packed my car, I remembered Rule 10. Always leave an old photograph by the door when you leave. It's an offering to keep your image safe. I ran back inside and grabbed a random portrait from the pile in the office drawer. The subject was a young man from what looked like the 1960s, his expression a mixture of fear and resignation. "I'm sorry," I whispered to him as I placed the photo by the door. That's when I heard it, the distinct sound of a camera shutter clicking. I spun around to see the last camera on the right, the forbidden one, had somehow activated itself. A photograph was slowly emerging from it. Don't look at it, I told myself. Rule 2 was very clear about that. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of the image in my peripheral vision. It showed the studio, but wrong somehow, like a negative of reality. And in it, dozens of faces were pressed against some kind of barrier, their features distorted as if seen through warped glass. I recognized some of them from the portraits on the walls, but what made my heart stop was the figure in the center. It was me, but not the current me. This was a future version, trapped behind that invisible barrier, pounding silently against it with bloodied fists. Behind her, behind me, stretched an endless void filled with countless other trapped souls. I ran. The desert night was pitch black, but I didn't dare turn on my headlights until I was several miles away. As I drove, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the studio following me somehow. But there was only darkness. I thought I'd escaped. I really did. For a few weeks, everything seemed normal. I went back to freelance work, taking whatever gigs I could find. But then I noticed something strange about my photos. In every single one, no matter what I was shooting, I could see a faint figure in the background. My figure. At first, it was just a shadow, barely noticeable. But it grew clearer with each photograph I took. Sometimes it would be lurking in a corner, sometimes standing right behind the subject, always watching, always smiling that terrible smile. My clients started complaining about strange artifacts in their photos. Children would cry when I tried to photograph them, pointing behind me and saying there was a bad lady there. But when I turned around, there was never anything to see. Last week, I got a call from an unknown number. When I answered, I heard my own voice, distorted and desperate. "Help me. I'm trapped in here. In the photograph. Please, you have to let me out." I hung up, but I know what it means. Part of me never left that studio. Part of me is still there, captured in silver halide and darkness, trapped between one moment and the next. And it's getting stronger. The worst part? I'm starting to forget what I really look like. Every time I pass a mirror or see my reflection in a window, my face seems slightly wrong, as if it's being viewed through an out-of-focus lens. Sometimes I catch myself moving in ways I don't remember initiating, smiling at times when I'm sure I was frowning. Yesterday, I found an envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a photograph of the studio, looking exactly as it did the day I left. But now my portrait hangs on its walls, right next to Sarah's. In it, I'm standing in the main studio, camera raised to my eye. Behind me, countless faces peer from the shadows, all wearing the same expectant expression. They're waiting for me to return. And somehow, I know I will. The camera's call is getting stronger every day, pulling me back to that desert studio where time means nothing and souls are captured one frame at a time. So let me leave you with a warning. If you ever find yourself driving through the Nevada desert and see a sign for Eternal Moments Photography Studio, keep driving. Don't look back. Don't take any pictures. And if you ever see my photo hanging on a wall somewhere, know that it's not really me anymore. Because the real me is trapped behind the glass, behind the silver and chemicals and time itself, waiting for someone to take my place. And I'm not sure how much longer I can keep smiling. They say a photograph steals your soul, but they never tell you what happens to the souls it takes. Now I know. And soon, you might too. Just remember, if you ever find yourself in a desert photography studio, pay attention to the rules. They're written in desperation for a reason. And whatever you do, don't look at that last camera on the right. It's always watching, always waiting, always hungry for one more shot, one more soul to add to its eternal collection.